Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is a extraordinary moment for me to be here at the inauguration of this extremely important initiative. It's a pleasure for me to be here, but before I get into some comments and reflections on what I've heard, I want to make sure that you all know that for me, I'm celebrating two births today. I'm celebrating the birth of this Center for Public Leadership, about which I have great hope and great optimism. I am also celebrating the birth of my first grandchild, who decided that he was going to wait until I left town to come into the earth. And I respect that, and I admire his courage and independence. In the same way, I admire the courage and independence of everybody associated with the center to try and address the really complex, difficult challenges facing Colombia as you go forward. There are so many thoughts in my mind, not just of my grandchild, but also of what you are undertaking. And I say you collectively because everybody here, by your presence here, has evidenced some interest in being part of the broader picture of what is going on in Colombia. I am thinking, for example, of the first time I visited the State of Israel, which was in the mid-1970s, before many of the people in this room were even born. And what I remember from that trip was thinking, and it's the first time I've thought about this in years, actually, and you'll see the connection in a minute. I remember thinking when I came back from that trip that if peace ever came to the Middle East, then all the other problems in Israel, which had been buried beneath the surface because everybody was concerned about peace, would begin to come up to the surface. And it feels to me that the same thing is true in Colombia, that the peace in Colombia has been such a dominant issue for so long that it has also provided a convenient way not to think about and address all the other issues facing this country. And so to me, one of the things I come away with in this trip is thinking about what is going to happen after peace takes place. That then it is going to be really interesting to be in this country. And every one of you is going to be critical to making sure that the work that has taken place in creating a platform, creating a peace opportunity, that opportunity is taken advantage of to address the most difficult issues facing this country. So I think that the center comes along at the absolute perfect time. The other kind of introductory point I would like to make is that the challenges facing Colombia are unique and distinctive, but they are also connected very deeply to the challenges facing the rest of the world. For better or for worse, and my wife says for worse, I spend a lot of time in airplanes, running around different parts of the world, thinking about leadership with people who are trying to address big problems. And the kinds of issues Colombia is facing not just in the peace process, but in the peace process, but also in what will come afterwards, are issues that are being addressed all over the world. Because you are, even though your issues and your challenges are distinctive, they are also connected, particularly at this moment in history, to what is going on in other places. So you can both think of yourselves as unique, but also think of yourselves at the same time as very deeply connected to challenges going on in the rest of the world. The most obvious of these is the peace process. Because if you can deal, if you can address, if you can get through this process, then you will be a model for the Middle East, for Eastern Europe, and also for the changing role that the United States has in the world order. So everybody really is watching you. And your success, your ability to see this through, your ability, if I may say so, to take the behavior of Carla and use that as a model for taking risks in behalf of something you care about, for putting a lot of what you have created at risk for some higher possibility, is something that the whole world will be watching and is watching. Let me begin by saying that I think of leadership as distinctive in four ways. That first of all, as has been suggested in the conversation which you just heard, that leadership is not a person, it's a behavior, it's an activity, it's a verb. So I'd like to encourage you to think about leadership by thinking about not who it looks like, but what it looks like. To try to think about it in terms of an activity or as a behavior, and not as a person. I believe that the conflation, the mixing up of leadership with people with big jobs, usually men with big jobs, is a myth which perpetuates the current reality. So I'd like to encourage you, and where I begin is to think of leadership as a behavior, not as a person. The second idea, which I hope is going to be at the heart of the center, is that leadership is episodic. It comes and goes. Nobody exercises leadership 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. None of us is a clean machine. We all have flaws. We all do selfish things from time to time. None of us can ever exercise leadership all the time. In fact, if any of us tried to do that, we would be taken out and pushed aside because leadership is a very risky activity. So trying to think about your own leadership. And that leads me to the third point, which is leadership is completely independent of position. It has nothing to do with the job you have. The opportunities for exercising leadership come before each of us every day. They come before you in your professional life. They come before you in your student life. They come before you in your civic life. They come before you in your family life. In my experience and observation, the opportunities for exercising leadership are alive and well at the family dinner table every night. The only question is whether you see those opportunities, whether you take advantage of them, and whether you do so in a skillful way. The position you have, whether you are a parent or a child, whether you're a boss or a subordinate, whether you're a teacher or a student, the position that you have brings with it certain advantages and certain disadvantages. But neither position is a complete resource for exercising leadership, nor is it a complete constraint. You can exercise leadership from any position, in any organization. It's not a surprise to me that when we think of the iconic people who exercise leadership, we think of people like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Gandhi. And these were people who exercised leadership with no position at all. And when we yearn for more leadership from people with big jobs, I think that forgets that a big job comes with huge constraints. Carla, in some ways, is in much better position to exercise leadership now than if she had gotten elected president, right? She has lots of advantages now, many fewer constraints on what she couldn't have said what she just said if she was president. So the position that you have in your family, in your organization, in your community, brings with it some advantages and disadvantages. But no position is a bar to exercising leadership. And the final perspective that I bring to beginning to think about leadership, which I hope the Center will also embody, is that leadership can be learned. It is about attitudes, states of mind, values, beliefs, identity, and that if you really want to exercise leadership, you can learn whatever is necessary. I believe that the exercise of the idea that people are born, I hope nobody in this room thinks that people are born having the capacity for exercising leadership, any more that people are born with the capacity for winning an election, or for playing the piano, or for kicking a football. In my experience, both personally and with my children, there were some kids who at age 5 or 6, they seemed to be natural athletes. Maybe some of you in this room were natural athletes. They could kick a football, they could hit a tennis ball, you put them in the water and they could swim without lessons. But in my experience and observation, those kids who were natural athletes at age 5, when they got to be 15 years old, they weren't necessarily the best players on the team. Because other kids who really wanted to excel had learned those skills and practiced those skills. And they were actually better than those kids who seemed to be natural at it. I think the same thing is true of leadership. I don't think there is any skill or any capacity that is useful for exercising leadership that you can't learn if you really, really want to. So those are the ways I begin to think about this subject. Now let's go from the beginning, the personal, you and your leadership, to try to take our view really, really wide and think about how this center and where the center fits in what's going on in the broader world today. To me, as maybe just about the oldest person in this room, I wouldn't want to test that, but it would be a good guess on my part. This is the most interesting time I've ever lived in, except maybe the 1960s, because so much is going on and so much is happening, and it is so unclear how it's all going to turn out. I hope I live long enough to see some signs of how it's all going to turn out. So the question really, the first question is, are the times we're living in, which for some of you in this room looking at you and guessing about how old you are, you think this is normal. For those of us who have been around a long time, this is not normal. This is very anxiety-provoking. Right? And the question for a lot of people, particularly a lot of people in positions of responsibility, positions of authority, the question is this a bump in the road, or is this a fundamental sea change? Another way to ask about this time that we're living in, is this an emergency, or is this a crisis? An emergency is like when you've got a fire in your home. A crisis is when your home burns down. Those are very different situations. And the way you attack them and deal with them is profoundly different. My first wife, my former wife, wonderful, wonderful lady. 3 years ago on New Year's Eve, she and her husband were having dinner with a friend. And they had a knock on the door. They opened the door and it was a policeman. They were at the friend's house. And then the policeman said, "Are Helen and Steve at dinner here?" And they said, the host and hostess said yes. And they said, well, they need to come with us because their house is burning down. And they went and they stood outside in the freezing cold on New Year's Eve and watched their house burn to the ground. And they realized, just think about this for a minute, they realized that the only thing they owned anymore was the clothes that they were wearing at the time. And everything was going to change. Everything they owned, every piece of furniture, every piece of clothing, the place they lived in, the kind of life they lived was going to be different. So the question we are really asking is whether we're in that kind of a time or we're in a bump in the road that is going to sort itself out. One of the ways of thinking about that in a more academic sense is, are we trying to deal with assessing the risks, or are we trying to deal with coping with uncertainty? Well, when I look at what is going on today, when I try to think about what is happening in the world, and I begin to look at all the variables, all the factors, the aging of the baby boomer generation, the turmoil in the Middle East, Arab Spring and the post-Arab Spring reality, the changing role of the world order, where all of my lifetime the United States has been a world power able to determine or influence the way things happen in a way that's no longer true, not only just militarily, but culturally and socially. I can remember when I first started traveling. This is a very American-centric view of the world, but that's the world I grew up in. And I remember when I first started traveling internationally, and I would turn on a TV in Latin America, or in the Middle East, or in Europe, and 80% of what I saw on TV was US television. And it was a very comfortable feeling. Well, you turn on the TV here or in Europe or in the Middle East, and that is not the case anymore. So it's not just about military and power, that the world is changing and the balance is changing, but it is also about social and cultural things. You know better than anybody else that what we used to call war and international conflict looks different than it used to look. And the history books and the rule books and all the things that military people learned are no longer relevant or applicable. And people are having to relearn, rethink, re-understand what it means to fight wars and to create peace. We're living in a period of time, as you know better than I do, because you live it in ways that I am just trying to catch up, where we are connected to each other, not only just through technology, but that's a piece of it, but also economically. You can't press down on the world order, on the economic world order anywhere without having ramifications all over the place. And all of a sudden you see things that are absolutely would be unheard of 10 or 15 years ago. Banking systems from different countries getting together and realizing that they are interdependent on each other. And that if they don't have a set of common rules and understandings, then the kind of crisis which we barely avoided 6 years ago is surely going to happen again. And then there is technology. You know, I look at this room and I can see the generational divide. 2 years ago, if I was speaking to this group, 3 years ago, I would have asked how many people are on Facebook. And not only would it have been a different percentage than now, but you could have looked out at this audience and seen a generational divide. So I could have predicted with a fairly high degree of accuracy who would raise their hands and who wouldn't. Who's on Facebook, who's on Twitter, who blogs. And now old people like me are starting to realize that if you're going to continue to function in this world, you have to function through the social media. You have to begin to understand that so many people are connecting with each other. I work with CEOs a lot. And I still find myself fighting this battle. And I say to CEOs, are you on Facebook? Are you on Twitter? Are you blogging every day? And most of them say to me, no. And I say to them, there are conversations going on in your organization every day, 24 hours a day, that are about you, and you have no idea what they're doing, right? And that's not a good situation. That's not optimistic, right? You need to understand that. You need to know about it. You need to be part of those conversations. I remember the first time I ever heard about climate change. I can remember it very clearly, because I was one of those people, and my guess is there are probably some other people in my generation in this room. I remember hearing it and saying to myself, climate change is something for my kids and grandchildren to worry about. I don't have to worry about it. Right? As it is, I like the warm weather, right? And it took me 10 or 15 years to begin to realize that it's my problem. That I couldn't pretend it was somebody else's problem, because it is affecting so many other things that I care about. That if I don't begin to think about where my place is, what my role is, what am I doing that's contributing to the problem, what am I doing that is addressing it, that all these other things that I cared about were going to suffer as a result. And when I think about the residue of the financial crisis, I mean, Colombia is a success story economically. You are doing much better than lots of countries in the world, but you're not doing as well as you might have been doing had not the crisis in 2008 taken place. And when I talk to people, and there aren't very many left, who lived through the Depression in the 1930s, one of the themes that I hear is that the experience of going through that period affected them in their lives and the way they thought about things and the way their attitudes toward the future for years and years to come. And I wonder whether we still understand what the residue of the economic turmoil that happened in 2008 is going to be. And finally, as I look around you in this audience, I think about the difference in values of my kids and me. I have 3 children, 2 in their 40s and 1 in his early 30s. And the one in his early 30s is a digital entrepreneur. He runs, I'm going to give him a plug now because he's just become a new dad and he needs the help. He runs a website called longform.org, longform, longform.org, and it is a site that curates long-form journalism. So for those of you who like to read wonderful, long stories about real life, it is a place to go. And they're now just about to launch their new app, which will be free. And so I'm encouraging you to take advantage of that for his sake, as well as for mine. But the interesting thing is that when he tries to explain something to me, it's not only hard for me to understand, but even when he explains it in very simple language, I sometimes don't get it. I also don't get the way he lives his life. It's not just what he knows and what he takes for granted, but it is also his attitudes and his values, which are very different than the ones that I grew up with and very different than mine. And many, many of the companies that I work with are struggling to understand and to incorporate the values of people in their 20s and early 30s who they are hiring and they hope will succeed them eventually in their roles. Well, you put all that stuff together, all those variables that I talk about, and what this says to me is that we're really in a period where you better think this is the new normal, even if you're not sure, and you better prepare for it. And I see the mission of the Center for Public Leadership at this university is preparing people for a world that is like the world we're living in now. And what does that look like? I think it has three central elements that make it different than any time that I've lived in my life. The first is that in a very profound way, the future is uncertain. We don't know what the future is going to look like, and anybody who tells you they do, I would not listen to. Because we cannot predict what the confluence of all these factors is going to produce. Nobody has ever been there before, and nobody who thinks they know the answer needs to be paid attention to. Second difference in the time we live, a very important difference for people who hang around universities, is that we're going to have to make decisions with inadequate information. Whether you are in corporate life or you're in NGO, nonprofit life, or you're in governmental life, because of the nature of the problems that we're dealing with, their complexity and their interconnectedness, you're never going to have enough information to be sure of what you're doing. You're never going to have enough information to be certain that you're on the right course. I have CEOs and senior people tell me that all the time. They tell me, I'm looking for my people to give me the data that I need. And constantly they're finding themselves in a position where the data isn't enough to tell them what to do. So inadequate information for making decisions. And third is that change is a constant. Change is not something that happens once in a while, but change is something that we live with as the normal way of leading our lives. So if you look at it, and I think, young people understand this better, much better than old people do. This whole idea of changing jobs and careers, which when I grew up was not on anybody's screen. And in the current generation, as I talk to people in their teens and 20s, is something that they assume is going to be part of their lives and is exciting to them. So what does that mean? What are the skills? If you live in a world in which the future is uncertain, that you don't have enough information to make clear decisions, and that change is a constant, what kind of skills are going to be needed to survive and thrive for people who want to exercise leadership under those conditions? And I think that there are three three kinds of skills which are complicated and difficult to teach, and they are complicated and difficult to learn, but they are essential skills going forward to help people exercise leadership successfully in the kind of times in which we live. The first is the capacity to meet and address new realities, to not be stuck in the past, to think of yourself and your skill set is how do I meet new realities? How do I become comfortable with something that is different than what I was comfortable with yesterday? The second, which I see in our consulting work all the time, is the courage to invent the future. I was talking with Pablo today, the wonderful president of this university, and we were talking a little bit about this leadership initiative and his role in nurturing this initiative, not only at the center, but throughout the university. And we began to talk about the reality that he didn't know what it ought to look like. And he was going to have to give people the confidence to try to invent the future themselves. And the role of CEOs and the role of people trying to exercise leadership is going to increasingly be about having courage to step into an unknown place, invent the future, and let other people take responsibility for doing that as well. And finally, there's this idea of taking smart risks and what that looks like. What does it mean to be more risk tolerant than you are now? What does it take to be less risk averse than you are now? How do you think about what you can do personally to take more risks on behalf of what you care about than you have in the past? I was struck by what Carla said about the question that she asked herself when she made the decision that she did to subordinate her own political platform to something that she thought was more important for this country. And the question that she said she asked herself was, what do I really stand for? Because leadership is inextricably connected to purpose. Leadership is inextricably, I'm trying to get a time signal. How many more minutes? How many more minutes? 10 more minutes, okay. Leadership is inextricably connected to purpose. And so I hope one of the things, and I'm really talking over the heads of the big feet sitting in the front row here, to the people who are younger sitting in the back, if you are going to care, if you see yourself as a person who wants to exercise leadership, then you have to figure out, what do you care about? What is so important to you that you'd be willing to take more risks than you have in the past? Now let me end by describing 6 new, trying to get closer to the ground, 6 new ways of exercising leadership that flow out of what I've been saying, and that I hope will be part of the agenda at the center. The first is that people need to focus more on adaptation than on execution. The skills that require to make something happen, to do tasks, are always going to be important. But the skills of how do you adapt, how do you take on new skills and new capacities and leave behind some of the things that have been useful to you in the past. Because the process of adaptation, whether you're talking about an individual or a country, is a process of taking on some new DNA and letting go of some old DNA which has been really useful to you up to now, but is now getting in the way. What is essential to Columbia, to this university, to you personally, to carry forward, and what of all the things that you value is expendable, can be left behind. Second is to think of yourself as running experiments rather than just solving problems. Because when you're stepping into an unknown place, that's what you're doing. You're running an experiment. You're testing a hypothesis. And thinking about yourself as running experiments gives you a lot of freedom to try different things and to learn from them, because there's no such thing as a failed experiment, because you're always learning something from that experience. The third is to think of yourself as practicing more independence and less autonomy. And that's true for individuals, for organizations, and for countries as well. I like to think about who are the unusual partners you can have. Who are the people who you can work with, who your own people, your own supporters, your own friends might not like you playing around with. And certainly I think that is going to be a challenge facing Columbia going forward after the peace process is signed and after, I hope, the referendum is successful. You saw it in South Africa, you saw it in Northern Ireland. The question of how do you incorporate, how do you live with, how do you embrace the people who you used to think of as the enemy is going to be a central reality going forward. So it's about unusual collaborations. It's about sacrificing credit. It's about leaving some of the past behind. Fourth, to think about yourself as in the business of orchestrating conflict, not just resolving it. That conflict is a sign of vibrant issue decision choices facing society or facing a family or facing a community. And you think of yourself as part of your leadership capacity to manage and orchestrate that conflict, not to temper it down, not to fix it. And fifth, to think of yourself as in the business of inventing next practices, not just looking for best practices. Training people to have the courage and the skill to invent the future is different than the courage and the skill to figure out what's working in different places and apply it here. And since you are on a frontier, the best practices in other places are not necessarily going to work in your context. And finally, the last point, and this is a kind of funny point to end on, I think for the kind of leadership we're talking about, you're going to have to think about your responsibility to take care of yourself. I've seen too many people burned out from the causes and the passion that they're committed to. And the world and your country and your community needs you to bring your A game. And you're not going to be able to bring your A game unless you're taking care of yourself, unless you're eating well and exercising, unless you're finding love and affection in appropriate ways so that those human needs are being satisfied. And the world is not going to give you the space and time to do that unless you do it for yourself and protect that space. For me, this is an extraordinary day because I do think of this as the birth of my grandson and the birth of this center, and I see possibilities, great opportunities in both. I think what you're embarked upon here is really important. It's not only important for this university and this country, but in a way that I think it's probably impossible for you to appreciate. The whole world is watching. If you can figure out how to address the enormous challenges facing Columbia, and do that in a way that brings the community along with you and treats the people for whom change is experienced as a loss humanely, then those of us who are watching and dealing with our own issues can learn enormously from you. So thank you very much for the privilege of being here.